Hello, and thanks for joining us. My name's Ian Stroud.
And my name is David Malone, and this is Hyperland.
We've been putting up a few of your films in some kind of celebration of Hyperland running for 12 months now.
Yeah, it's been rather lovely for me. Slightly egotistical, but I can't pretend I don't like it.
Oh, it is. But we have a special guest on today.
We do. So an old friend called Roger Lewis. We thought to have Roger on for a couple of reasons. One, Roger watched this film that we're going to talk about, The Far Side, back when it came out.
Yeah.
And he wrote one of the most interesting reviews of it. And he's also been part of the Hyperland community from the beginning. And before that, we got to know each other from the old Golem blog, where he was a regular contributor. So we thought it would be really nice to have one of our listeners who's such an informed person on. So, Roger, thanks for joining us.
Hi, David. Hi, Ian.
Hi.
Lovely to be on.
So you both watched it?
Yes.
Have you watched it, Ian? Because I know you're up to your eyeballs in editing at the moment. Did you get a chance?
I did watch it. I thought the interesting thing was that it was 30 years celebrating Horizon, which was made 30 years ago.
Oh, God, that makes me feel so old. Mikey.
Well, no, I mean, you weren't there.
That's
at the
definition of old,
Horizon.
though. The definition of old, I've decided, is if you can think of a big number, subtract it from your age, and find you've still got a big number. From an editing, from a professional point of view, did you think it? Because it was a very early film. I mean, obviously, I didn't edit it. It was a wonderful editor called Christy Hanna.
Yeah.
She was a brilliant editor. But as a professional, what did you think of it as a film?
Well, now from a televisual point of view, I think it's probably one of my biggest complaints at the moment is we're not seeing documentaries of that ilk on our screens today, which I think is a shame. But I mean, it's the commissioning process, and it's the people who are telling the television industry who is watching what and when, and therefore we get stuck with crazy people on ice dancing and that kind of nonsense.
What about you, Roger? What did you make of it?
Well, I rewatched it in 2022 when I wrote the article that I wrote, and having known you for a number of years, and you mentioned this one and Icon Earth, and I rewatched it with the question, why did David get put on the naughty step by Auntie B for making this documentary?
Yeah, well, I certainly did, yeah.
And so I think the reasons why you were put on the naughty step then are very similar to the reasons that people were put on the naughty step during the COVID-19 episode, in terms of contradicting the mainstream narrative that is signed up to by government, and the same naughty step exists within scientific inquiry now, and it was the political narrative behind the promotion of materialistic science, all tied into the arrow of time, just to sort of make a pun about the one you put up yesterday. Between the World Trade Agreement in 1999, all of the protests against the WTO.
Yeah.
And I know, watching this film, it's not so apparent that that's what's on your mind. I know it was, but it's very apparent when 10 months later Icon Earth came out.
That's really interesting you saw that, because that is exactly right. I don't think I've ever really told anyone that, because it's not terribly interesting, except that I got, for some reason, I started to read all about what was then called the Uruguay round of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and I realized what was going on, and I realized we were going to be signed up without any parliamentary discussion, because it never was discussed by Parliament, to this WTO under the Uruguay Agreement, and that was the beginning of globalization, and we were going to be signed up to it.
Yeah.
And that really, have you twigged, was what was in my mind for doing Icon Earth.
Yeah, and I see them as a trio, and there are 3 banned episodes of Horizon right? This one, The Far Side, Icon Earth, and Human Laboratory. And you and I spoke to Jan about Human Laboratory, and of course that's disappeared altogether.
Yeah,
And it would be interesting to see how long The Far Side survives on YouTube, because it's never survived for very long when I've put it up.
Ooh. Right. I didn't. Oh God. I didn't realize. I mean, you're right about the Human Laboratory. That was my mate Jan Klimkowski, with whom I did the COVID film, because Jan essentially retired, and I persuaded him to come back out of retirement to help me make that, because he's such a good filmmaker, and he used to be a lawyer, so we knew that the COVID film would be a legal nightmare. And so I thought, well, if we got Jan on board, that's like having a howitzer behind you. But of course, he had cut his teeth on, as you said, doing Human Laboratory with a producer called Debbie Cadbury, and that film, the Home Office got involved, and so it is interesting that they're the three films which don't appear.
These two as well, and that one really is it challenges. It's taboo. It's a taboo area, and but of course globalization is a taboo as well, and it was easy to put you on the naughty step because it's about Horizon, which is a science program, but because of the timeline, 30 years from 64 to 94, and then of course, as Ian pointed out, it's 30 years since that film, and a lot of water's passed under the bridge since. So for me, on The Far Side, the star of the show is Tony Benn.
Isn't he brilliant?
Yeah. And also she's now Professor Goebel, the Scottish physicist that you interview, or Karen Goebel, is it? So
yes, that's right.
I looked her up when I wrote my thing 2-3 years ago. And one of the things she says is that the technology and the science, AI and stuff like that, computers, she said then, well, it's up to us to control it.
Yeah.
And in my piece, I said, well, if you read this, how do you think we've done? And I don't think we've done that well. Looking back, clearly it controls us. We don't control it, but we do have that choice.
Yeah.
And that's the central core of what Tony Benn says in the film. And it's the phrase that Harold Wilson used, the white heat of technology.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, what he was actually saying was the white heat will burn you. It wasn't an exciting white heat. And well, there you have it. That's the crux of, to me, it's guns or plowshares, guns or butter.
Yeah.
Same with technology. And he also makes the point that the main driver of technological research is actually military technology, which that opens up the discussion, but it opens the doors of the mind. Well, young films always do that, and gets people asking awkward questions. And Tony Benn, who I think is the star of the show, as it were, does say that.
He's very down to earth, isn't he? When he says, someone came up to him in his constituency and said to him, if they can put a man on the moon, why can't we have a decent bus service?
In Bristol.
Absolutely, yeah.
So concretely down to earth.
Yeah. So, and his fame, I think it's in this film that he says it, and people quote him quite often, is how did you get this power?
Yeah.
What are you allowed to do with this power you say you have?
Yeah.
And most importantly, how do we take it away from you?
Yeah. How do we get rid of you? He says. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And that's in this film. I mean, it's been quoted 1,000 times since. And then the other one is the Milgram experiment bit about people actually giving up their personal agency to authority.
Yeah.
Yes.
So follow the science.
Well, see, that's the interesting thing. That so much was written about the Milgram, but not so much that. Initially when Milgram did his experiments, the reaction was, this shows how the ordinary people can do evil things. But that's not really what it showed.
Yeah.
Because they had to run that experiment a few times, and I think they did one with all women, and they abandoned it because the women just wouldn't do it. and lots of people wouldn't do it. And the key thing, which got really downplayed in the first reactions to Milgram's experiments at the time, but was only picked up on later, and we picked up on it obviously, is the key is the man in the white coat. Because every time they don't want it to go any further, he says, well, you must do, because it's the experiment, and that's what they do.
Yeah. So there's that bit. I think it's the Milgram experiments as well, where they actually pay one control group quite a lot of money to agree that black is white, as it were.
Oh, maybe. I don't know that one.
The more you pay someone, the more likely they are not to see it's wrong, or they're peddling, the wrong answer. So that's the old, it's really hard to make someone see something if their salary depends on not seeing it. It's similar.
Yes, indeed. Well, the other thing which I wanted to try and put into later films, but I wasn't able to. There were various films I wanted to make, and they were turned down. And it came out of the research I did on the Milgram, which is you might be familiar with it. I think the only academic I know who's written about it is Frans de Waal, who does work with bonobos and chimps. And the Milgram experiments were just the perfect encapsulation of what people wanted to believe at the time, because it comes right at as America's going through and recovering from the Vietnam War, and it was the beginning of the kind of selfish gene era. And so they wanted this notion that essentially people are selfish and prone to do bad things. And what's less well known is at the same time and slightly earlier, there were two groups. I think one was at Pittsburgh and another, I think it might have been Northwestern, who were doing experiments which showed a completely different side. The most famous one, well, I say famous, it's not that well known, but the most startling one is, and I'll describe it very briefly, they put a monkey in a cage and used the Skinner behavioral training so that it would, when a light came on, it would press a bar and it would get food. And then, having trained the monkey on this, they then put another monkey, which the first one could see through thick plate glass, so it couldn't hear the monkey and it couldn't smell the monkey, but it could see it. And then what happened is, when the light comes on in the first monkey's cage and it presses the bar to get its food, it gets food, but a very large electric shock was given to the monkey in the second cage, which the first monkey saw. So it would suddenly see this monkey in enormous pain and distress. And what they found, and they did it several times, is that the monkeys they tested would stop pressing the bar, and the monkey that's getting shocked, they're not related to it, they've not seen this monkey before, so you can't explain it away in terms of kin selection. The monkey that would press the bar to get the food would stop to the point of starving itself. They were never reported because it was the wrong message, and that was something which I wish I'd been able to put into the film, because it shows that what science tells us, it's only the things that people want to hear at that moment that they bother listening to.
Yeah, well, it's the problem of consciousness, isn't it? And that's Rupert Sheldrake's thing. So that's morphic resonance and all of that, with rats in mazes, and so B.F. Skinner, behaviorism, he's kind of like the father of modern behaviorism, or where Milgram comes a bit later. Yeah. But I don't know if you've read it, but B.F. Skinner published a novel called Walden 2.
Yes, I've read parts of it.
It's a really interesting novel, because it's sort of a dystopian novel, but not. So if you read 1984 or Brave New World, which most people have, I know you're into Lem, aren't you?
Yeah.
B.F. Skinner is talking about this utopian community and how to control people. And there's a sheepdog that they call the Bishop, and they have sheep to mow the lawns, and there used to be an electric fence, but now there's just a bit of string, and it's like this metaphor within the novel showing how you can manipulate people's behavior. It's a behaviorism thing, and that's it's Pavlovian.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting. And of course, your film challenges the scientific narrative. So it repeats in the thing about we want experts to convince sons that their fathers are bad fathers and that their mothers are bad mothers.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
it was an extraordinary piece of commentary, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, there's the Benjamin quote, and then there's the beautiful song that comes in. So you take that sort of, well, I would call it a metaphor, and that's a beautiful song. And I looked it up, and that track came out in 1994. So it was kind of it was a contemporary track, which was quoting Anna Arendt's friend who didn't escape the Nazis.
Yeah.
And it sort of ties it in. So although it's
it was lovely,
94,
wasn't it?
It actually ties back to 44.
Yeah.
So the narratives are very long-term things, and the narrative running through science is a very long-term thing as well. And so the point I would make about it all, tying it all together, is what Carl Polanyi calls the Science Republic. And it's against the Science Republic. So he wrote a famous essay, I think it was in the 1960s, it might have been 68 or something. And in the Science Republic, what he basically talks about is scientism as opposed to science.
God, I don't know this essay.
Oh, well, yeah. There's a climate scientist who's been drummed out of the Brownies, Judy Curry, she's called. And I mean, she's been on the IPC and stuff. She was a fully tenured professor, and she resigned a professorship to actually talk about the science effectively. And the Science Republic, the other person that feeds into that is Michel Foucault and his theory of the episteme. And the theory of the episteme is what is allowable as being called scientific in a field of scientificity, is what he says. So it's what's allowed. And that ties into Zizek always goes on about some philosopher, things that are barré, they're just excluded. And so I watched The Hour of Time the other day, and you were talking about musical metaphors. So you've got measures, time, and then you get into, well, music and classical music, it's notation. Music is more than just the melody and the time. There's timbre and all sorts of stuff that comes through the musician, and it's outside of the language.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And so metaphysics is outside of the physics, and that ties back into Kant and the Critique of Pure Reason, etc. And it's these things which are excluded by hard materialism.
Yeah.
So
yes, you're right.
You get into all of these scientific dogmas.
Yeah.
And that's what this film does. It challenges all of that.
Yeah.
And Tony Benn clearly is not any sort of Luddite.
No.
But it's like, where does this lead?
Yeah.
Which way should we steer this? And what do we need to keep an eye on? So then you get back to Professor Goebel actually saying, we need to control it. As long as we control it, we're all right.
Yeah.
And so, like I say, how have we done?
Not very well. But Roger, it's what I'm hearing from your description is you're talking about soul. You're talking about something.
Well, absolutely. The thing I was excited to see was the edited down "Why Are We Here?" the Curiosity Stream theories.
Yeah.
And so we're talking about mind.
Yeah.
The problem of mind and consciousness, and reducing it down to a spreadsheet, a technocratic spreadsheet. It just challenges that head on. So
Yeah.
there are lots of themes in it. That there's like the teaching in an oral tradition,
Yes.
Yeah.
and that's just after Arthur C. Clarke saying, "Oh, the future's going to be fantastic."
Yes. But the other interesting thing about the Far Side was how the message coming across was power will be given to those that are able to manipulate, which is what we're talking about. This kind of the expertise is kind of only I know this, and what it does is and I say we sort of more, I suppose, from the Western side, put blueprints over other cultures and societies, and for I think good reason, or we think it's good reason, but quite often it just totally destroys. So it destroys that storytelling, passing on cultures and
Yeah, I mean, David mentions in, I think it's on the introduction to Arrow of Time. It might have been this one about the you get back basically to Heraclitus and Parmenides, so that's free will against determinism.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And deterministic materialistic science denies free will. So my question, usually, I was talking to someone with Ranjan the other day, and I sort of said, and he was quite big into his physics and stuff.
Yeah.
And I said, well, I've got a question for you. So, do you believe in free will? Do you think free will exists in the universe or whatever? And he didn't. And I sort of cut my teeth debating philosophy with basically a hard eliminativist philosopher, guy called Judd Evans. Basically called the brain meat. I mean, it was a lovely guy, Judd, but he was a hard materialist, eliminativist philosopher.
Yeah.
That absolutely wouldn't have, free will's not a thing. I mean, I come at free will from a Pelagian view, which is an orthodox kind of Christian, Jewish, and Muslim view. I mean, the free will is allowed, and is seen as a gift from God. So the dynamic between David and Ard in Why Are We Here? Ard is a physicist, with of faith, and then you were talking to other people that weren't. So outside of the Abrahamic tradition, okay, you've got Taoism and Confucianism, okay, and they've got yin and yang.
Yeah.
So in Why Are We Here? Martin Nowak, I thought, for me, he was the star of the whole show.
Yeah, it's very good.
And 12 to the log 2 minus 8, when that cropped up. Now, basically, that's the inverse of the exponential. Okay, so hard materialists and all the rest of it, they're quite happy with the exponential because it kind of it sort of plays into their hands. But what dogmatic scientists do is they close off boundary conditions, and they don't state their boundary conditions, and they also so this gets into Gödel and undecidability, Tarski, etc.
Well, we'll come back to him when we talk about dangerous knowledge.
Well, of course. You see, so running through your work, which I'm a big fan of, and I rewatched a lot of this stuff. I watched Dangerous Knowledge shortly before we met, which was it was back in about 2009. I think it was 2010/11.
Right.
And I started studying philosophy when I moved to Sweden in 2010. And I came across your film Dangerous Knowledge. There's a friend of mine in Sweden called Stefan Calverdal. He's a composer. And he said, have you read Gödel, Escher, and Bach?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Now, Bach is equal temperament, all the rest of it, which is basically a codification of music, which means you can play a piano and everyone can play in whatever key it is.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the modes of music, which go back to, classical times or whatever, for instance, Plato banned all other modes apart from the Phrygian mode in his Republic.
Yes.
And the reason being that its Phrygian mode doesn't get you all excited. It's it's like dirges.
And then the Christians adopted the same nonsense.
Yeah, quite. Absolutely. And of course, it excludes human spirit, the stuff that gets commitment. And science in a hard materialist way wants to get rid of that, especially if it's used as part of a narrative to
exclude other things. Yeah.
Well, it's basically to empower the priestly class.
Yeah.
Well, it's
true. I mean, I agree.
Ian Banks at the start of it, he sort of said, Horizon
It's a religion.
was the thinking person's song of praise, which had me on the floor.
Yeah, but it's true. I mean, science and science broadcasting at the time, I mean, Horizon was very closely linked to Nature magazine through John Maddox, who I ran in. I had in fact, I had a major run-in with him and his wife over Icon Earth. I was invited on to Start the Week when it was run by Melvin Bragg, and I was essentially invited on as the tethered goat, so that the dogs could tear me apart. But we'll talk more about that when we talk about Icon Earth. But you're right about the mainstream science. What I always felt was they didn't like the idea of science having any kind of relationship to things which obviously do have a narrative, like the narrative of an economic power or the narrative of political power. But then they take a further step and say, well, and we don't have a narrative at all. We just have facts. And I mean, it was brought home to me once. I can't remember if it was under research for Icon. And I called up this fellow who, I won't give you his name, but he was an FRS and very well respected. I started trying to say, look, I phoned you up doing this project. And he interrupted me. And this is exactly what he said. He said, you're talking about philosophy, aren't you? And he put the phone down. There was no sort of, well, thank you very much for calling. I'm really not very interested, I'm sorry, I think this is silly. Your whole thesis is silly. He put the phone down as if the way you'd put down a piece of infected meat, like, oh my God, put that down. He said, you're about philosophy, aren't you? Clunk, that was it.
I was talking about Maddox and nature. The BBC produced a series called The Heretics. This is in the 80s now. And Rupert Sheldrake's on one of the episodes, and Maddox interviewed on that. And he said, I don't believe in book burning, but if I could burn books, I'd burn Rupert's book.
God. Well, that and thing is, it still goes on. They're just more savvy about not being so clear, because I mean, if you think about everything we said in the Far Side, just was there in capital letters during the whole COVID thing, and. What was the Proximal Origins paper, except that it was an attempt at book burning? You mustn't listen to anyone.
What it does is it makes people think, and the distractions and narratives are designed, especially the fear-based ones, are to stop us from thinking and thinking critically. Yeah. So I was talking to my sister this morning, and she was saying, "Oh, have you seen that stuff? Apparently, President Putin has." Or Lavrov, whoever it is, has said that they're going to arm their enemies in the same way that NATO have been arming Ukraine, the Russian Federation's enemies. And it's actually been suggested that there are Russian warships on their way to Cuba. So like a replay of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
And I said, well, blimey, it's a good way of making the point. It is a good point they've been making, prior to 2014 and the Maidan stuff. But this idea of, if you expand the discussion and give latitude outside of what's called the Overton window, and there's an Overton window for discussing scientism. We all know that. We've all seen it. And what a documentary like The Far Side does is it gives people permission to, range outside of, the string that's there in Walden 2 for the sheep, all watched over by the bishop, which is the sheepdog.
Yeah. I mean, the interesting, when you were talking about Walden 2, of course, the obvious thing to say is that that string, that enclosing string, which you don't even want to go up and touch, let alone cross, is what the internet does now, because the internet is based on, I mean, when you talk to the people who actually wrote the code for Facebook, and I talked to some of them, they're quite clear that it is behaviorism. It is a Skinner box. The internet, and particularly Facebook, particularly social media, it's written to be a Skinner box. The little, for those who don't know, it's the box you put the pigeon in, and if it randomly presses the right little button, you give it food, and in that way you can literally teach a pigeon to waltz. And that is what they've written, the whole way that you get likes, and the little, even down to the number of milliseconds of pause that happens, is also to make social media into a Skinner box for people.
Yeah, precisely.
There was the other point that in the far side that you were making was the access to information. And I think there was one bit that you mentioned, sort of, the Chinese powers are frightened that people in China can communicate to the outside world. Well, obviously they've got around that, but generally that thought of the internet's come along and we can chat outside the box, we can chat with more people, we can be raising different thoughts, but it's completely failed on the social media and I mean social media influencers. It's done nothing, because there are people out there that just, again, they're after it's either greed or it's fame, or it's a mixture of them both. But
I mean, I think we can, and we have a false impression that we are. A lot of the time, because this is echo chambers. But on the point about guiding and manipulating the discussion or the narrative, on the Hyperland box, I put that trial of a forum, because what I miss is the old all the comments on the Golem blog.
So do I, mate. That's what I'm hoping.
Having a proper discussion.
That's meant to be now on Substack. We're trying.
Well, yes. The thing about Substack is it's a ghetto where we all go.
Yes. And
we all think we're speaking freely and no one's taking it down, but we're all singing to the choir.
Yeah, we're talking to each other.
But not in quite in more of a market square, but it's a market square where all the troublemakers go. Yeah. And that's where we've all been put.
On the naughty step.
On the naughty. It is the naughty step, precisely.
Yeah.
Oh. But on this point about discourse and that forum, it actually was coded by the same guy that coded Substack. Right. And Substack is a forum, a bit like Reddit, say. That except it's the opposite of Reddit, because it's to get to an answer and to give the model answer. And if you want to get a model answer, too much discussion or thinking outside the box, which is where creativity lives. Okay. Creativity isn't where science lives in terms of looking for a single answer, a universal, right? And discourse is coded the other way to Substack, the opposite, like the yin and yang. So
So we're on the wrong platform.
No, Substack's different because it's kind of a blog kind of thing, but discourse is a forum. Forums don't exist in the same way as they do on the old internet. The old internet did have forums. They were called message boards, kicking off. And there was discourse. And discourse is not the same as, say, Paulo Freire's sort of teacher-student dichotomy. So there's the empty vessel idea of education, which is basically the state pours the indoctrination into the empty vessel. And that's what you believe. And if you believe this, you're not going to go far wrong. Whereas Freire says that it's, it's a two-way process, and so you're learning and discovering together.
Yeah.
And when you have discourse and imagination and in an atmosphere where there isn't a censure, there's not a possibility of being excluded.
Yeah.
That's when people really learn, and when creativity can push forward the boundaries of knowledge.
Yeah.
And so, and basically, that's what Carl Pollyanna says in the Science Republic. It's self-sustaining the institution as opposed to expanding the knowledge.
Yeah.
And so that's where we've got to. I think, in terms of, I see it's the globalist power base, and they're the ones that are saying, stop the world, I want to get off. It's like, stop the world, no one's allowed to get off, and now it's all cast in stone.
Yeah. I mean, the most flagrant first attempt at that, well, not first, but a flagrant attempt was, the end of history. Remember?
Quite. Yes. Yeah.
Francis Fukuyama, I can't remember.
Yes.
I bought it and read it, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. I just thought, how can anyone seriously say that history has ended? But it was lauded as this great landmark. So you're right.
Yeah.
I mean,
Tolstoy said, for materialists to say that the Bible is no longer relevant, let them write the Bible of materialism.
Yeah.
And then maybe we can talk about it. Because he said, basically, in the Western tradition, a child growing up without the Bible is as unimaginable as a Greek child growing up without Homer. Maybe Fukuyama's attempt, maybe that was the attempt at the Bible of materialism, and of course
failed.
It failed. Yeah.
But I mean, that was why I started with the Walter Benjamin quote, because it's such a clear challenge to the whole notion of progress. And it's not that I don't think it is certain that you can see some aspects of progress. It's not that there's no such thing, but to just think, that things can only get better.
Well, quite. Yeah.
And can I mean, it's a pure aside, but you mentioned the track that I played, which had part of the Walter Benjamin quote, and of course that was Laurie Anderson.
She said, "What is his story?" And he said, "His story is an angel being blown backwards into the future."
And the funny little link is the person who mentioned it is Fawn Flynn. He said, "Oh, you must have this," and of course I then put him in the flow of time later.
Yes, right. Yeah.
So there are these funny little links that happen.
Yeah.
I was gonna.
It's all connected.
Just before Tony Benn was talking about how do we get rid of you, and he was talking about the democracy and the control of democracy and the IMF, and how it was all it's all been taken away from us anyway.
Yeah, there's a really moving part in there where they're talking about a farmer buying the seeds and couldn't afford and had gone from 3 acres to 1 acre.
Yeah.
Yes.
So he gets into all the great old stuff like Solon's reforms, agrarian reform under Roman law.
Yeah.
So that's 30 acres and a mule, 3 acres and and an oxen or whatever. So 30 acres and a mule was basically in the 1920s. There was a Georgist thing like Henry George, and it's about being self-sustaining. I mean, it is a Sunday, isn't it? So it's kind of like gleaning in the fields, which gleaning is outlawed. That's tyranny.
Yeah.
Gleaning in the fields is in the Bible, and I'm a businessman, so leaving something in it for the next man.
Yeah.
Like I don't subscribe to a scorched earth philosophy of business. So all the game theorists, for instance. So the beautiful mind, for instance, game theory is the result of a paranoid fantasy.
Right. I mean, yes, I'm glad you raised that, because that whole, the way that they lionize the that whole beautiful mind game theory and
Quite. No,
pernicious stuff, actually.
His academic partner is a guy called Martin Shubik, who's written, I think, the best summary of what the monetary system is. He calls it the command and control system of governance.
Yeah.
And Shubik is brilliant. He's not paranoid in the slightest, and there are interviews with him. There's I can't remember, maybe 10 years ago. I think he may have passed on now. But within that theory itself, it's an interesting thing, because obviously some people do think that, but they're the non-cooperators in Martin Nowak's
Yes.
work.
Yeah.
So,
and people forget that game theory essentially started back with Johnny von Neumann, and is it Morgenstern or Morgenstein? They wrote this theory of economic behavior, and that's where the first major work of game theory, and then the selfish gene, the whole idea of inclusive fitness. I've forgotten the name of the scientist, of course I shouldn't have, but Dawkins' mentor, he actually got the ideas for inclusive fitness when he was out in, I think it was Minneapolis, with von Neumann and Morgenstern, that group.
Quite.
And it's all zero-sum games. It's all, if I win, you have to lose. And von Neumann was aware that his theory didn't really work for multiplayer games.
Well, von Neumann was very aware of maths as a conjuring trick, and he's the one that said, give me 3 variables and I won't just get, your graph to draw an elephant, I'll make its trunk wiggle.
Yeah. But it was an interesting film, The Far Side, and it was interesting, the reaction was so swift when a very senior scientist said, why was this made at all? And why did you allow this David Malone fellow, what was his authority for doing it? And it was the use of the word authority which set me off, because I thought, okay, I didn't know you had to have authority in science. I thought you just had to have the facts.
You've got to have permission to think, David.
Yeah. But it was a very strange one, that there was this outrage, and it seemed to be an outrage that I had been behind the notion that I had said, look, maybe the shiny narrative that the Green Revolution was a wonderful thing wasn't true, and all the rest of it. But it was just, they were really annoyed that I had said science, like everything else, has a cultural context, and the questions it thinks are the questions it should answer, and the answers it come up with aren't based on just evidence.
Yeah.
The questions
it's definitely the political context, isn't it, that upset them?
Yeah. Very that I should think there was a political context. It's not that I had broadcast the wrong political context, and that they would have been happier with a different one. The crime was to point out or to argue that there was any political context, and that is still goes on.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
The whole business with Fauci and the rest of them. Oh, we just follow the science.
Except the world of authority. That's what it's about.
Yeah, because science itself is following something.
Yeah. That's the old Nazi thing, which is authority to below, obedience to above.
Yeah. And it's not to say, and the thing is, I've so often been accused of being anti-science. I was accused of being anti-science on a panel at the How the Light Gets In festival down in Hay. When I was on a panel, they said, but you're just anti-science. And I was slightly speechless, because I've never considered myself anti-science. I've spent my life learning from scientists and talking to scientists and thinking about science, and then to be accused of being anti-science. And it was simply because on that panel, as in my films, I said, well, there's a political context of, why do we think that the answer to world poverty is GM crops?
Yeah.
And to ask the question isn't to say, oh, and I think GM is a terrible thing. It's just to say, is that the right answer to the question of world poverty?
So on that, that clip, it also does mention population, and I think we should talk about that because your films, they open they open people's minds, but they also open people to sort of saying, hold on, is there a subtext here? So on that population question, the GM crops, it was the rice, wasn't it, and what have you?
Yeah.
The idea of overpopulation, depopulation, eugenics, the eugenics, the pseudoscience of eugenics, etc., which does shoot through, is shot through the narratives of the 20th century, which are driven by Rockefeller Foundation. They've been the biggest funders of science and economics academia. They funded the Chicago School of Economics, for instance.
The people who gutted.
Now you've got the Gates Foundation, Garvey, etc. What's the underlying ideology of a massive strand of funding outside of the democratic institutional structures that we are all expected not to question?
Yeah.
And that's a huge question which comes out of the far side. It also comes out of Ike and Earth, and it comes out massively in the human laboratory. It also comes out massively from the net result of 2 years of COVID scientism, of following the science, but denying all theories of epidemiology up to that point, including that humans have an immune system. It
was horribly political. You're right. I mean, the whole COVID thing. I mean, we're going to in the next couple of weeks, we're going to interview Sunetra Gupta because she's working on bird flu vaccines and is a real expert on bird flu. But of course, she was absolutely crucified during COVID when they wrote, what was it, the Barrington Declaration?
The Barrington Declaration. I'm glad to hear she's a signatory to that because no one mentions it, and they were right.
Yeah. Proper science went out the window with COVID, and there were just a narrow range of accepted answers which were given, which had the mantle of scientific authority wrapped around them. And
it's not the only science that does that. The other one is climate science. Climatism.
Yes, you and I have discussed this many times. Yeah, I mean,
well, talking about another film, the film you didn't make, David, you were asked to make The Great Warming Swindle on Channel 4 and didn't.
Yes, I was asked 2 years in a row by heads of science departments. Yeah. This is shameful business.
So the way that narrative ties back in, so Tony Benn at the end of the film mentions the IMF.
Yeah.
And anyone that doesn't think the IMF, the Bank of International Settlements, and the large global international banks are not invested in the climate change narrative just hasn't been paying attention.
Yeah.
No, and not through their investments in oil and gas either. It's an investment in the metrics, so the metrology of money. What does it measure? Well, it doesn't measure anything in a scientific sense. It as it exists, it's basically it's not a fixed variable.
No, so, they need something to pin it to. And
my favorite thing explaining fixing variables or whatever is Rupert Sheldrake's thing on Big G, but that it was a variable, but now they've fixed it by definition. Yes. So it may be going up and down all over the place, but we'll never know. It's very funny.
For people who don't know, it's in his book, The Science Delusion, and it's one of the earlier chapters, and I've talked to Rupert about it. And very, very briefly, although it's very much worth reading that chapter of the book, he says there are these variables, so these constants, and gravity is one of the main constants. It's 9.8 meters per second on Earth, and this is the way it is, and everything's measured against it.
Yeah.
And he simply points out that at various times when scientists have actually bothered to measure it, they don't get the same result.
Yeah.
and Rupert being Rupert, and he's a soft-spoken, he's a very charming man. Whether you think he's an inspirational genius or a crackpot, it doesn't matter. In this sense, he's charming, he's open-minded, and he goes and simply asks these people. And they said, well, we measured and it came out to be this. And someone else said, well, no, we measured and it came out to be that, which is a problem.
Yeah. Well, they published tables, and he looked at the tables, and he went to see the guy. Yeah. It's so funny. It's just says, oh, it's one of the worst episodes in our science. Terrible that you should have found. And he said, don't worry, we fixed it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, before we wrap it up, we should just mention briefly, since you raised it, the whole population thing, because of course that is again one of the huge taboo questions, and that's a terrible thing. It's that you notice in that boundary between science and political power and money, that when certain questions become too big and protrude out of science into these other spheres, they suddenly become taboo. You're just not allowed to talk about them.
Yeah.
And we have this problem just within the Green Party. There's a section of the Green Party that wants to talk about population and overpopulation, and another group whose response to that is, if you even want to talk about population, you're a racist.
Yeah.
And it's
Orwell's famous essay talking about so this is going back to managerialism, Burnham, and he wrote there was kind of a discourse between them, and Orwell wrote a critique of Burnham's book. But there's also a guy called Straight, and he was also involved in that debate, and also around the European Union and the idea of making Europe safe. And what Orwell said is that in India, it's not counting Indians. He actually says not counting the N-word. That's the title of the essay. Okay. But he actually points out, well, actually, the ideal world that they're talking is it's white people like them, excluding everybody else, the rest of humanity. And overpopulation is, it's part of imperialist white supremacy. I do believe that. I mean, I'm not a Black Lives Matter. I'm not a bleeding heart liberal at all. Far from it. But Orwell made the point then, and it's a point that's made now. And they're right. It is. Eugenics is, it's about a master race. And there are subsets within that want an elite sort of syncretic kind of, but I think they want syncretic plebs who are totally controllable.
And that the problem is that argument is it's true. There are people who have those opinions, but does that mean that therefore
Boris Johnson and his dad are one of them? Dominic Cummings' father-in-law is another.
Yeah, but my question is, given that there is that interest in the overpopulation discussion, but does that mean that therefore there isn't ever going to be too many people, that we could have 20 billion, 40 billion, 100 billion people on the planet? And of course you can probably support 18 billion as long as you get rid of almost all other species and just have it as a big sort of scientifically controlled monoculture. And that's the problem, is that you need to be able to open up a debate and say, can we say that there is a number of people which would be too many?
I have to say, I wrote an essay about it because I got into a massive argument with a Club of Rome guy. I'm interested in energy economics, and so so this is Dr. Tim Morgan's blog, which is called Seeds, which I'm habitually banned from, but because I do think that carbon is a good way of actually basing money in a measurable, in a metric. right?
Yeah.
Which it isn't at the moment. And if you haven't got a checkable or a falsifiable metric, that means things can be arbitrary.
Yeah.
In the same way that PCR tests give an arbitrary result.
Yeah.
Right. And if a absolute power or an institution of power, a government, has the ability to make arbitrary judgments, you can't have that in law. It's more of a thing in law now. So just on the timing, this documentary came out in 1994. Tony Blair got in 97. When Tony Blair got in, things didn't improve. You've had the Keir Starmer purge of socialism from, what's he calling it? Different Labour now or something, not New Labour. It's different Labour, whatever it is.
Bloody hell.
And the simple point is that things didn't improve when Tony Blair got in. Law became more arbitrary, introducing the Supreme Court into English common law.
Yeah.
And the same thing has happened in the US Constitution and our Constitution are quite different, but they're both founded in common law.
Yeah.
And the simple point is Roman law and European law is top down and can be arbitrary. It's very authoritarian. And as British people, we don't sign up to that, and Americans don't either. They don't like our way of doing it because they hold it against George III, etc. So there's all this stuff going on, but essentially, it's freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of association, and personal agency and free will. So it does boil down to Heraclitus and Parmenides.
Well, I was also going to say all of those things were the things that were written within a 20-year period, within a few hundred yards of St. Paul. That is the English Revolution you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
The unfinished revolution, I might add.
Yeah, precisely. So Alexander Pope, Epistle 2, right?
If you say so, Roger.
Well, yeah. I don't go around memorizing poetry, but I've got a window open on my phone here. Where is it? Here we are. Right.
Go on then. Give us a reading.
Epistle 2, Alexander Pope. Know then thyself, presume not God to scan. The proper study of mankind is man, placed on this isthmus of a middle state, a being darkly wise and rudely great, with too much knowledge for the skeptic side, with too much weakness for the stoic's pride. He hangs between, in doubt to act or rest, in doubt to deem himself a god or beast, in doubt his mind or body to prefer, born but to die, and reasoning but to err. Alike in ignorance his reason such, whether he thinks too little or too much. Cares of thought and passion all confused, still by himself abused or disabused. Created half to rise and half to fall, great lord of all things yet prey to all. Sole judge of truth in endless error hurled, the glory, jest, and the riddle of the world.
You cannot get a better ending to a podcast than that, Roger.
Thank you very much, Roger, for coming on. We must have you back on.
Oh, absolutely. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, it's been great talking to you, mate.
It's good to talk to you again, Roger.
Yeah, you too. Talk soon. Take care. Cheers, guys. Bye.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed that, you can head over to Substack or YouTube and leave us comments. We'd love to know what you thought, what you agreed with, what you disagreed with. Thanks very much.
But there is a storm blowing from paradise, and the storm keeps blowing the angel backward into the future. And this storm is called